Mr. President, I rise to commend this body and my colleagues. Every single senator voted unanimous consent to move forward on the National Defense Authorization Act, which was signed into law just this week by President Trump. In particular, I want to thank the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, John McCain, who did so much to shepherd this important piece of legislation through this body and to the President's desk. And I want to thank Senator McCain for all his service and sacrifice for America for decades. Decades. The NDAA, as we all know, is an important, critical piece of legislation boosting our national security, rebuilding our military readiness, and protecting men and women, the men and women in uniform who serve our nation. It's been a piece of legislation that for 56 consecutive years, on a bipartisan basis, has moved through the Senate and the House to be signed by the President. So a lot of times you hear there's not a lot of bipartisanship that's going on in Washington. Well, on issues like this, Mr. President, there is. As I mentioned, this bill, which authorizes almost $700 billion for our troops who need it, passed the Senate unanimously. But, Mr. President, not all the members of the military had their bill that authorized spending and funding for what they're doing has moved through the Congress. Unfortunately, our men and women in the U.S. Coast Guard, our nation's fifth branch of service, have been once again left behind. The NDAA covers the Army, Air Force, Navy, and Marines. The Coast Guard bill, the Coast Guard Authorization Act, focuses on the heroic men and women in the Coast Guard. So this year we worked hard on that bill. Senate Bill 1129, the Coast Guard Authorization Act of 2017. I sponsored this bill with Chairman John Thune, the Chairman of the Commerce Committee, Ranking Member Bill Nelson, and Senator Lisa Murkowski. This bipartisan bill, and it's very bipartisan, will give the Coast Guard the resources it needs to protect our waterways and coastlines, block illegal traffickers and smugglers of drugs, and more efficiently procure future cutters, Coast Guard cutters, which our country and my state desperately need. Very, very important bill. In constructing this legislation, we worked in a bipartisan manner for months. However, it appears, despite broad support from both Republicans and Democrats, the Coast Guard Authorization Act, a critical bill for homeland security, for the safety of our mariners and fishermen, and for showing the support of the thousands of men and women who serve in the Coast Guard, unfortunately, the bill has become stuck. And as chairman of the committee responsible for the U.S. Coast Guard, I must speak up for the men and women of this important service and the critical services they provide, because this bill should have been moving months ago. Mr. President, not only does this bill contain critical needs and authorizations and funding authorizations for the Coast Guard, it also contains provisions of vital importance to our maritime and fishing communities. Included in this legislation is important language to permanently fix an issue that has been around for years, one that pertains to incidental discharges for those in our fishing fleets, also known as the Vessel Incidental Discharge Act, or VITA, as part of the Coast Guard bill. Currently, vessel owners and operators are forced to comply with a patchwork of burdensome federal and state regulations for vessel ballast water and incidental discharges. This creates inefficiency, adds costs, inhibits economic prosperity for my state and for the country. while not providing a uniform standard to protect the environment, which is also critical. This fix that's in the Coast Guard bill would provide the maritime industry, the fishing industry, with a consistent, uniform regulatory structure, restoring cost-effective commerce while also ensuring environmental protection of our nation's ports and waterways and fisheries. And notably, for a large number of my constituents, this provision, the VITA provision in the Coast Guard bill, provides a permanent exemption on incidental vessel discharge for all fishing vessels and small commercial boats. Very important, because previous legislation required even small fishing vessels to get a discharge permit from the EPA to simply hose down their decks. These fishing vessels and small vessels are facing potential non-compliance if we fail to pass the Coast Guard bill soon. And they should not be penalized for the refusal of some of my colleagues, a very few number of my colleagues, who are opponents of this important fix, to allow for what we think is a bipartisan negotiated solution to move forward. The fix in this bill on VITA is supported by all segments of the maritime industry, U.S. and international vessel owners and operators, fishing vessels, both large and small, passenger vessels, charter boat operators, labor unions, and the Navy League of the United States, marine terminals, port authorities throughout the country, just to name a few, all in support. So, Mr. President, there's broad bipartisan support and agreement that this bill, with the VITA provision in the Coast Guard Authorization Act, should move forward, Democrats and Republicans. So I was going to come down here this evening and ask unanimous consent that we pass the bill now. Out of respect for some of my colleagues who are still working in good faith on this issue, I've decided to refrain from that. But, Mr. President, we are losing patience. There have been numerous suggested compromises to help get a few senators to yes on this. We have accepted almost every single one of these. Every single one of these. We are negotiating in good faith. We even held a big meeting this afternoon with many staff on another suggestion, which the EPA said was an unworkable idea. So, Mr. President, I believe we're now down to one single issue on this important piece of legislation. Out of respect for my colleagues, one of whom I just got off the phone with, Senator from Michigan, who I have a very close working relationship on the committee that oversees the Coast Guard because he's my ranking member, we're going to try to work through the weekend and resolve this. But I hope that the remaining senators act in good faith, because what we don't want to see as we accept every single compromise put forward is the goalposts keep being moved. The deadline is fast approaching for our fishermen and maritime fleet. We must get this done. And the deadline is long past to show that we respect, care for, and want to do all we can to support the men and women of the Coast Guard the way we support the other military services, as we saw this week when President Trump passed a very bipartisan NDAA. So, Mr. President, I call on all of my colleagues to work through the weekend so we can get the yes, they can get the yes on this very important bill, the Coast Guard bill, so we can support them the way we are supporting the other men and women in our military. I yield the floor.